It's been a problem area for the Jets for years, but are we about to see a big breakthrough? We're talking Jets wide receivers today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, May 9th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangReadNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, today on the show, we're going to talk about the wide receiver position for the New York Jets. We're going to continue our series where we're going position by position, asking the big questions the Jets have at each spot on their roster. We're turning our attention to wide receiver, a spot where, to put it mildly, the Jets have had issues for a number of years, but a spot where the Jets could be on the verge of a breakthrough this season. Of course, 2 years ago, things started to turn with the drafting of Garrett Wilson, 10th overall, and he'll be the first person we talk about because Garrett Wilson's off to a really good start to his career. Back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons for the Jets. A guy who's clearly defined himself as a number one receiver in this league. The question is, how good can he get? And I think heading into this season, a lot of the questions for Garrett Wilson will be similar to the ones we had 12 months ago. The question is, can he elevate his level of play even higher? Now, where he's at right now is plenty good. And, heading into last season, the Davante Adams comparison was thrown out quite a bit because Davante Adams was Aaron Rodgers' number one receiver for a number of years, and Davante Adams was a top 3 receiver in the league for a good portion of Rodgers' late seasons in Green Bay. And, I don't know stylistically whether it's the greatest comparison in the world, but I think people were wondering, can Garrett Wilson go from being, a 1,000-yard receiver, an 1,100-yard receiver, to somebody who produces on a Davante Adams level, where we're talking about him among the top 3 to 5 receivers in the league. And in some ways, I feel like this question isn't super important to answer. And in some ways, I don't feel like it's fair to Garrett Wilson to ask these questions because, quite frankly, Garrett Wilson's a great success for the Jets, even if he stays the 1,000-yard to 1,100 guy he's been his first 2 seasons in the NFL. That's a tremendously valuable player to have. In fact, it's the type of player the Jets have lacked for years and years and years. I mean, outside of that season with Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker, the Jets haven't really had really high-end receiver play. I mean, you'd have to go back to like the early Rex Ryan days, those first couple of years when they had the AFC Championship teams. And before then, Lavernius Coles had a couple really good seasons. Jericho Cotchery had a couple really solid years. Jets have really lacked, though, for much of their recent history, a reliable number one target. And that's what Garrett Wilson is. So no matter what he does, I mean, the guy Garrett Wilson is already is really good. The question is, how much has he been held back by bad quarterback play? The last 2 years, Jets have had bottom tier quarterback play. And last year, I think in particular, it wasn't just the quarterback play. The entire offensive infrastructure was broken, where the Jets really didn't have much beyond Garrett, aside from maybe Breece Hall, but he was a running back. So the question is, how much more can Garrett produce? And the question's a little bit nuanced because there are actually some things I think that maybe helped Garrett's production out last season. And some of it, when we talk about the Jets did not have pieces around Garrett Wilson, yeah, that meant he drew tougher coverage assignments, but it also meant he got a greater share of the targets. Garrett Wilson was actually 4th in the NFL in targets with 168. The only 3 players who had more targets than him were CeeDee Lamb, Mr. Davante Adams himself in Las Vegas, and Tyreek Hill. And, of those 3 receivers, 2 of them went for over 1,700 yards. CeeDee Lamb had 1,749 yards. Tyreek Hill had 1,799 yards. So Tyreek Hill almost had 1,800 yards. Garrett Wilson produced 1,042 yards on 168 targets. And that's not a sign that Garrett Wilson did anything wrong. It's just a sign that the Jets force-fed him targets last year. I think there were a couple factors at play. One of them I've already mentioned, that Jets didn't really have any other options. So that meant the ball was getting forced to Garrett. And I think this is true on a couple levels. First of all, he probably got more plays where he was the primary target than he would have otherwise. Second is, I think that he was the only receiver the quarterbacks trusted, and with good reason. So, if all things were equal, he was getting the ball. The quarterback wasn't sure what to do. The ball was probably going to Garrett Wilson. And there's also probably an element of the quarterbacks didn't really know what they were doing, especially Zach Wilson and Tim Boyle. So, they may have had moments where they weren't sure what they were reading in the defense. So when in doubt, you just throw the ball to Garrett. You throw the ball to the guy you trust. And, Garrett's the one guy who, if even when he's not open, you feel like maybe you can throw him open. Maybe you can throw it to a spot where he can get open. Garrett's targets, I think, are quite likely to go down this year, in part because, Aaron Rodgers is not going to force the ball. I think last year, Garrett Wilson was kind of force-fed the ball. And that's the reason for what I'd say the lack of efficiency. And that's not Garrett Wilson being inefficient. That's just the Jets passing game being inefficient in general. Aaron Rodgers is not going to give him, I would be surprised if Aaron Rodgers gave him another 168 targets because, Rodgers likes to spread the ball around. Rodgers can find the open guy. If there's a guy on the backside who's open, Rodgers isn't going to force feed it to Garrett. He's going to throw it to that guy. I think you also have to account for better targets this year. Mike Williams. Mike Williams is a really good number 2 receiver for the Jets. A guy who can kind of take some of the heat off Garrett. A guy who, if Garrett needs a break, we can run a play for Mike Williams. A guy who, if Garrett's not open, you have a quarterback now who can see that we have another good receiver here. I'll just throw it to the number 2 guy. So I think that what's very likely to happen is that you'll see some sort of bump in Garrett Wilson's production. I probably would take the over on the 1,042 yards this season, but I don't know that we're going to 15 or 1,600 yards. And part of that's just the things I laid out. But I think that we'll see greater efficiency. I think the efficiency level is going to go way up because, when we're talking 1,042 yards on 168 targets, that's not super efficient relative to, other great receivers in the league. I went you through some of the other guys who had more targets than Garrett last season, how they went for over 1,700 yards. But I think that, you're going to, even if you see the same level of stats or even a little bump, it'll be in less targets, which means you're having more success. It means you have less failed plays. And again, I think that a lot of this was much more on the quarterback and the offensive line than it was anything Garrett Wilson was doing wrong. But I do think, Garrett does have a few physical limitations that may prevent him from being like one of the very, very best receivers in the league. He does kind of struggle with the more physical, bigger corners at the line of scrimmage because he's not super small, but he's a little undersized. And I think that's an area where that he has a little trouble. And that's why I think in many ways, Mike Williams is a great guy for the Jets to have, because when they get into matchups against teams with bigger and more physical corners, you can stick Mike Williams at the X and you can free Garrett up to, maybe play the Z a little bit more or, move to the slots. And there's been some talk that the Jets may want to have Garrett Wilson in the slot more than they did a year ago. And it makes sense because he's such a good route runner. He's such a technician. He's a guy who can create separation like with a snap. And another thing I'd like to see the Jets do is get the ball to Garrett more in space. I think Aaron Rodgers is going to throw him a lot of smoke routes, which are essentially there are moments where if a corner is giving a receiver too much cushion, if a corner is playing like 8 to 10 yards off the receiver, sometimes what the quarterback will do is just say, forget the play. You just take the snap and throw it to Garrett Wilson. Aaron Rodgers does that a lot if he likes the look. So Garrett Wilson's probably going to get a few more catches on those smoke routes this season. And I think, with his change of direction ability, he changes direction so effortlessly. I think he's a guy the Jets can utilize more in space. And I think that'll be one area where that definitely happens. Now, speaking of the Jets getting the ball to players in space, there's a guy they just drafted a couple of weeks ago on day 2, Malachi Corley. As we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets, we'll continue our look at the Jets wide receiver position, some of the big questions. And I think one of the questions with Corley is how good can he be? How fast? We'll give you some thoughts on that continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This next segment is brought to us by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased in your life. So today I want to tell you how I really feel about something, and you're probably thinking the same thing. The Jets, 13 straight years, no playoffs. So many expectations last year with Aaron Rodgers, they fell short. But optimistic about this season. Jets have made some interesting moves this offseason, so maybe things will get better. And, therapy can be different for everybody. And most of us have different problems than our favorite sports team missing the playoffs 13 straight years. It's frustrating, but real life is real life. Sports is sports. It's important to get things off your chest and the important things every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, we're talking about the wide receiver position, some of the big questions facing the New York Jets heading into 2024 at the wide receiver position. One of the questions is, how good is Garrett Wilson going to be? In a different way, there's a similar question for a player the Jets drafted a couple weeks ago in the third round, Malachi Corley. Jets traded up for him. Jets were pretty vocal that they really, really liked Corley. In fact, indications are that he was their number 4 receiver on their board after Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze. And, the Jets really like those top 3 receivers. So for Corley to be 4 right behind them shows that they were pretty high on Malachi Corley. The question is, what's his role going to be? How good's he going to be? Robert Saleh kind of gave an indication over the last couple of days where he indicated that they're going to work hard on Corley to improve his route running. But Saleh kind of indicated that, he's a bit of a work in progress when it comes to running routes. And Saleh suggested that the real focus with Corley is going to be figuring out ways to get him the ball in space. And that makes a lot of sense because that's how he was used in college. He was a guy who was converted from the running back position and in many ways kind of played a role that was similar to a running back at Western Kentucky, where they threw him a lot of screens. In fact, over half of his catches were screens. And when you talk about a guy who's catching screens, well, he's kind of doing similar things to what a running back would do in the NFL, where, he's got the ball in his hands. He's kind of reading the blocks in front of him and trying to make plays and break tackles and make guys miss. It'll be interesting to see what role he plays this season for the Jets. Now, of course, I think the Jets would love to get him in the lineup as much as possible. And if he shows that he can learn very quickly how to run routes, they'll get him in there. That could be easier said than done, though, because the route tree in the NFL can get very complicated. I'm not sure Corley's ever run a pivot route. I mean, especially when you're talking about a guy who projects as a slot receiver. There's a science to running what are known as option routes. And option routes mean that you're lined up in the middle of the field at the slot. You could break either left or right. And it all depends on the alignment of the defender. Essentially, your job is to run to the spot where it's going to be easier to get to. And the quarterback has to be on the same page because the quarterback's making the same read. And the quarterback knows you could go to one of two spots. So he needs to know where you're going. He needs to know exactly where you're going to be. And Aaron Rodgers, in particular, is the type of quarterback. He wants his receivers to be in a specific place. There's a reason the Jets brought in Lazard and Randall Cobb last offseason. Now, one reason is that they weren't very smart bringing those guys in. But another reason was that Rodgers trusts these guys, and it takes time for Rodgers to build trust with receivers typically. You can go back to Devontae Adams. It took years for Rodgers to really trust Adams to know what he was doing. Rodgers is known for being a quarterback who's very tough on young players. And I know, people will point out, people will always find some exception out there. But the reality is that for a lot of receivers, it's tough to gain Rodgers' trust. Can Corley do it quickly? I think what we do know is what Saleh said is the Jets are definitely going to design touches for Corley, trying to get him the ball in space. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the most creative mind as our offensive coordinator and Nathaniel Hackett, but you can still figure out ways to get him the ball on screens. You can design touches. I think that, the end around a game Xavier Gipson was getting, that'll probably go to Corley. If you want to talk about returns, Corley did not really return much in college, but there have been some good returners in the NFL who weren't big, who didn't really get the opportunity much in college. And return a game similar to what Corley's good at doing. Returns catching the ball, catching a kick, and then you have the ball in your hands and you're reading your blocks. You're trying to make guys miss and you're trying to break tackles. I mean, it's kind of what you're doing. It's kind of what Corley was doing anyway. And I think Corley should get some touches in the backfield. We know he knows how to play running back. And if we're talking about, what touches are available, how many opportunities are going to be available to Corley? Well, we know Garrett Wilson's going to get a lot of targets. Maybe not fourth most in the league again. Maybe not 168 targets, but Garrett's going to get a lot of targets. He's the number 1 receiver. Mike Williams is a good number 2 receiver. He's going to get a lot of targets. People won't love it, but Alan Lazard, Rodgers likes him. I think he's going to be part of the offense. Lazard's going to get targets. Got to have some targets for Tyler Conklin, maybe a couple for Jeremy Ruckert thrown in there, and then the running back targets, which will mainly be checkdowns and screens, but those will still exist. There aren't many targets left for Malachi Corley. You know what touches there are available? We don't really know who the number 2 back is behind Breece Hall, and those touches, I know the Jets just drafted a couple running backs, and I know Israel Abanikanda back in 2024, at least for training camp. But if Corley is that good with the ball in his hands, give him a couple of handoffs behind the line of scrimmage. And we talk about how he may not be up to speed as a route runner. Well, you know what? Most running backs don't run very good routes. Outside of like the Christian McCaffreys or Alvin Kamara's of the world, you're not getting very sophisticated route running out of running back. So he's a guy you can stick in the slot still, but you kind of motion him out of the backfield, and maybe then you can get him lined up against a linebacker. Makes life a little bit easier. I think expectations should be in check for Corley. If you look at what players drafted between 60 and 70 typically produce, the middle of the pack cases around 300-ish yards as a rookie. If Corley does that, he's fine. And fortunately, for in a rare instance, the Jets have put a player like this in a decent spot. Normally, the Jets are taking these super raw rookies and throwing them in the lineup, and like they need to be plus starters right off the bat, which almost never happens for third-round picks. As much as people like to pencil in third-round picks as automatic starters, it usually doesn't happen. The Jets have put themselves in a better spot this year than they typically do because you've got Garrett Wilson and you've got Mike Williams. And I don't want to say you're in a better spot because you have Lazard, but you do have a number 3 receiver who, at least in Lazard, who is overpaid. Look, there's no way you can justify Lazard at this price as your number 3 receiver. It's a bad contract, but he's here. And that's just the way it is. And if you look at what Lazard's historically done in his career with Aaron Rodgers as his quarterback, you can live with him as a number 3 receiver. I mean, you're not happy with him, you're not thrilled with him, but you can live with him as a number 3 receiver if he bounces back, which, I mean, I don't know. It depends on your definition of bounce back. Do I think he can get back to being the guy he was in Green Bay, who was a very unremarkable number 3 receiver? Yeah, I do. And that leaves Corley in a spot where, you know what? He'll be the gadget guy. They'll design touches for him in space. He'll probably get his few shots as a kickoff returner. And if he plays well, if he looks like he's really good, well, it's not like benching Alan Lazard's the worst thing in the world. He can earn a spot on the field. He can earn a role in this offense, but there's not a lot of pressure on him. And again, if he can hit like 300 yards, that's actually pretty much in the range of what you'd want in a rookie in that spot. And he'll be on his way to justifying the pick. But if he can do more, and look, the Jets drafted him. Look, the hype the Jets have given him, they're expecting more. I think there's no question about it. That he was ranked the 4th receiver on their draft board. And, I know teams say that all the time about guys they drafted. I know they always say the board fell perfectly for us. We really wanted this guy. We had him ranked so high. I get the feeling the Jets are telling the truth in this case because there clearly were indications that they looked to trade up pretty early on day 2 of the draft to get Corley, and they didn't get him until the top of the 3rd round. So clearly they were big fans of Corley's game. I think they're hoping for more, but it's a good spot. And of course, if he produces, I think he turns into a quality number 2 receiver behind Garrett Wilson, then suddenly your receiver position is looking pretty good for the next 6 to 8 years. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a couple of veterans. There are some guys beyond Garrett Wilson and Malachi Corley, the homegrown talent for the Jets, who have some questions to answer, and we'll get to those as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, which makes getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. And, of course, if you're a Knicks fan, you're probably very excited. Are you thinking about going out to Indiana for Games 3 and 4 of their second-round series against the Pacers? Game Time is the place to get tickets. Again, you have amazing last-minute deals. I haven't used Game Time yet to buy NBA tickets, but I've used it for plenty of other events. I went to the Holiday Bowl in San Diego last December. I went to a Broadway show back last fall. I went to the U.S. Open tennis last summer. I used Game Time right before the event, got amazing deals, great tickets at a low price. Game Time's the place to go. Just a couple taps and you're there. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, Locked On NFL. It's one word with no space for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're talking about questions the Jets have at the wide receiver position. We've talked about some young guys, talked about Garrett Wilson entering year 3, Malachi Corley entering his rookie year. There's some veteran guys who have some questions. And I think the most obvious one would be Mike Williams. How healthy is he going to be? Jets have kind of given us mixed signals on Williams. You know, there's been suggestions he's kind of like on the Breece Hall trajectory. Of course, you remember Breece Hall last year, first carry of the season, ripped off a 28-yard gain and got him on his way to a good season where, you know, there were some hiccups along the way for Breece, but a lot of his issues, to the extent he had issues, and he almost ran for 1,000 yards behind a horrible run blocking offensive line. But, you know, to the extent Breece had issues, a lot of it was that offensive infrastructure that was just completely broken. I think to get almost 1,000 yards behind that line, that's pretty good for Breece. There's also been some suggestions maybe Williams won't be ready for training camp. Well, I guess Breece wasn't ready for training camp last year, so it's tough to say. You know, the Jets seem to be preaching caution, which might be a good thing because, you know, if you followed Robert Saleh's tenure with the Jets, he's been overly optimistic about a lot of injuries. So maybe the fact that they're expressing caution about Williams is a good thing. As long as he's ready for week 1, I think the Jets are in decent shape. And, you know, even if he's not ready for week 1, if he's ready for some point in the early part of the season, I mean, shouldn't panic just because the guy's not ready for week 1. The important thing is for Williams to get healthy and for him to play the bulk of the season and to be a good number 2 receiver behind Garrett Wilson, you know, be the deep threat the Jets need on the offensive side of the ball, be the big, you know, that big guy who can go up and win contested catches. That's what the Jets need. Beyond Mike Williams, I think there is a question. We kind of laid it out in the last segment about Allen Lazard. And look, I think we should temper expectations around Allen Lazard. We should have tempered expectations last year. If you were one of those people saying Allen Lazard's a good number 2 receiver because he had 787 yards in 2022, well, I'm sorry. You should have realized that Lazard was not that good. But I feel like we've kind of gone to the other extreme with Lazard, where Lazard in Green Bay was perfectly fine as a number 3 receiver. I'm not going to say he was a good number 3 receiver, but he was fine. If he was your number 3 receiver, he was fine. And now we've gone to such another extreme where people act like Lazard can't play at all. Now, in fairness, the guy that was out there last year was awful. Lazard, the guy we saw last year was not an NFL caliber player. But if you look historically, Lazard has not been the drop machine he was a year ago. Now, he hasn't been a particularly good receiver. I don't think he's like adding any surplus value to your team. Does he run good routes? No. Does he create separation? No. Does he win contested catches? His contested catch win rate is under 40% for his career, and it's been consistently in the pros. And you talk about the great contested catch artists in the league, they're catching around 60% of them. Lazard's under 40. Yeah, that's not good. And for such a big receiver, his lack of contested catch ability is not good. Can he run to a hole in the zone and catch it when he's wide open? Last year, no, but for most of his career, the answer has been yes. I mean, there's going to be a lot of talk about how Aaron Rodgers is going to save Lazard, and Lazard's a much better receiver with Aaron Rodgers. Well, look, anybody's a better receiver with Aaron Rodgers, or anybody's a more productive receiver with Aaron Rodgers, because when you run to that hole in the zone, Aaron Rodgers is going to find you in a way Zach Wilson's not, in a way Tim Boyle's not, in a way Trevor Siemian might be able to see you, but he won't throw you the ball. Yeah, Siemian, if you watch this film on Siemian, I was researching an article on Siemian. It was just unbelievable how, like, he wouldn't throw to open receivers. You know, he'd see them, but he wouldn't throw it to them. Rodgers will see Lazard when he's open, and he'll get him the ball. And really, for the number 3 receiver in an offense with Rodgers, if Rodgers is playing well, you just need to be able to catch the ball when you're the wide open guy, when your route takes you to the hole in the zone. If you do that, you'll be fine. So really the question, can Lazard get back to being a functional player? Because the guy we saw last year was just brutal. That's really all there is to it. So I kind of like, I don't want to say I'm optimistic about Lazard, but I don't think he's as bad as the guy we saw last year. And I was the guy last year who was trying to like really, really temper expectations on Lazard, because when you watch what he did in Green Bay, it was not impressive. But he wasn't that bad. He wasn't as bad as the 2023 Jets Lazard. He's never going to justify that contract. That contract was an awful contract. But he's not going to be that bad. I mean, that was like, you're the Trumaine Johnson of offense last year. I think he's going to be better this year. I think he should be fine as a number 3 receiver. And if not, maybe Malachi Corley will be on his heels. And, the last questions we can ask if we get back to the younger players, you want to talk about Jason Brownlee or Xavier Gibson. Can they take the next step up? And look, I'm not super high on either of them. I don't think either of them showed a whole lot last year. They were both undrafted free agents. I think making the team was an accomplishment for them. The Jets gave them both snaps late in the season, trying to just get them some experience. I don't think either of them really distinguished themselves outside of Gibson being the hero of week one. Gibson might be the kind of guy we always remember him for that one game that he played, that one great moment, but didn't really do a whole lot else. But, we'll see what they can do in training camp, and we'll see whether those reps they got last year actually lead to any improvement. And perhaps they can, make a move on Lazard if Lazard's not up to par. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.